Hello everyone and welcome back to FUSION24. Please take your seats for our final panel discussion. There's more to come afterwards. And if you're joining us online, hello and welcome. You can join in the discussion using the Q&A box at the side of your screen. In this session, Forging the Future, we're looking at the progress that's being made towards building supply chains. Please welcome onto stage our panel chaired by Denton, Director of the Fusion Association in the UK.
Almost full room, despite the fact that we're surrounded by some of the greatest pubs in West London, which means that you clearly all care a great deal about supply chain, so thank you for being here. And before I talk about the pub anymore and get tempted to go, can I invite on stage our fantastic panellists? We've got Joanne Bailey, Faris Fakhry, Heike Freund, Sean Lynch, and on screen, Laban Coblentz. What we thought we'd do is have a bit of fun, because it's late in the day and everyone's tired, and your lunch is probably starting to make you want to fall asleep by now. So, we are going to do a little intro from everyone, say who we are, say something interesting. That's the challenge I gave my esteemed colleagues. Say something interesting in 30 seconds. And then we'll start the panel session. But I really don't want to squeeze the audience out till the back end. So if people have got burning questions, things you really need to get off your chest, please pop your hand up. Even before I'm inviting questions, I would love for this to be a really interactive 40 to 45 minutes. So I'm going to start next to me, and I am going to use notes so I don't get this wrong. Faris Fakhry. Faris is a member of the Advanced Nuclear Production and Experts Group at MIT. He also works with early stage and growth equity venture capital funds. He's co-founder of Iradia Solutions, an MIT spin-out that is working on delivering low-cost, highly scalable materials and fuels testing. Faris, say something interesting.
Well, first, thank you for having me. So a lot of the work which I do at the Nuclear Experts Group at MIT is looking at supply chain vulnerabilities, both in advanced fission and fusion. But I think when we're starting to look at fusion going from R&D to pilot to commercialization, the main thing which is actually constricting the supply chain isn't TRL, it's not technology readiness level, it's capital, not just size, but types, vehicles, different instruments, and a lot of the work which I've been doing is looking at how can we expand the types of capital which we're looking at in fusion, when, where, how, who, is a lot of the work which I've been doing, and communicating that to everywhere from early stage VC to credit funds, on what that could look like.
Thank you, Faris. Joanne Bailey. Joanne Bailey's got a long CV, but she works currently with Hatch Business Development and occasional project management. And she has spent her career further in research and technology development in the Canadian and global nuclear industry. Joanne, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
30-second state of the nation. What's your worldview?
All right. So my role in the fusion industry right now is kind of fun. So Hatch has a lot of experience with all kinds of power plants. So when we're talking about thermal power plants, we don't really care that much what the source of heat is. We like to deal with all of the things around the source of heat. So this is really fun to be sort of sorting through these issues with fusion as a heat source for a power plant and doing all those sort of balance of plant things. Now the actual interesting thing, if anybody wants to know how the sport of roller derby is played, come get me, I'll tell you, I referee. Okay.
There's only one sport at the minute, it's football, and you're not allowed to talk about anything else for the next 6
months.
Fine. And Heike Freund is Chief Operating Officer of Marvel Fusion, where she focuses on building and scaling the company, professionalizing processes, and what I think is going to be really interesting to discuss here, forming partnerships with industrial partners. She was previously a partner at McKinsey. Heike.
Hey, pleasure to be here today. At Marvel, we are pursuing a laser-based approach to fusion, and I'm happy to talk about the laser supply chain more on this panel. But I think the notion that I got from the previous panels is really fusion is happening, and it will be here. And in 10 years from now, we will see fusion power plants. So I think everybody in industry has to ask themselves the question: will I become a supplier to this industry? Will I become customer of fusion energy? Will fusion energy disrupt my business model? So I think those are questions that industry leaders need to start asking themselves now. And in this panel, we're going to discuss a bit one part of it, the supply chain.
Awesome, thank you. And Sean Lynch, don't worry, we haven't forgotten you, Laban, we are going to come to you. You're facing me from in front. Sean Lynch is a major projects director for AtkinsRéalis, but he was until recently Deputy Supply Chain Director for Hinkley Point C. So we've got a man here who really knows what it takes to deliver really big things with really complex supply chains. Sean.
Yeah, I guess my background is I'm 6 months into fusion. So I've learned a hell of a lot today, quite frankly. But what excites me is I think we're at a point now where we have to start thinking about building things and really building projects. But it isn't just the technologies that we put in. I think the key thing I really learned from both Hinckley and I was on HS2 as well, is the impact on the communities that we operate in and how we have to build supply chains that are relevant locally, not just internationally, because we have an impact on the communities. We build these power stations. Something of the size of Hinckley has a massive impact on the communities we build in. We have to show that we're there for them, we're there for their benefit, and we actually put a bit of cash in their pocket as well as the major suppliers. So that's a bit I'm really interested in, is how we pivot from that technology to actually building projects that create jobs and change lives.
You should have finished on that, by the way. That was really strong. And last but by no means least, on screen, we have Laban Coblentz. Laban's got an incredible CV, including time with the International Atomic Energy Agency, working on nuclear diplomacy in places like Iran and Iraq. But he's, for 8 years, been head of communications for ITER in the south of France, where 35 countries, as we'll know, are collaborating to make fusion real. Laban, over to you to give sort of an opening statement on anything you want, really, including roller derby.
Sure, I'm terrible at roller derbies. My ankles are bad. But if you look at my window, actually, you can look directly at the largest fusion plant in the world, still under construction. Interesting thing, two things. First, about 2 weeks ago, we took a 90-degree turn in our mission. I think we held a workshop for people like Heike and others that are building fusion plants in a private sector. So we started a private-public collaboration. That's a big switch for us this year, or this week. Sorry that I can't be with you. We are reporting on that and some other stuff to our semi-annual ITER council meeting, our governors. Second interesting thing, I grew up in the U.S. Amish Mennonite. If we would just switch to that, if all of us went to Amish, we wouldn't need fusion.
Fantastic, thank you, Laban. So look, we need to start off with why we're here, and I'm going to come to Heike, I think, first. Heike, what are the opportunities for the supply chain in fusion? What are they going to be like? When are they going to come? How can companies look to get involved?
Yeah, so I think on the one side, when we talk about the opportunity, we obviously always talk about the power plants that are coming in 10 years from now and so on. But I think the opportunity is actually here already now and today, because of the 40 private companies out there, at least half of them have announced to build some form of technical demonstrator over the next 2 to 3 years, and each of them is a 100 million to 200 million size of physical infrastructure that's being built. So there is real money that is being spent over the next couple of years already now. And I truly believe that suppliers that come in early on, that get involved early on, also will be in the best position to also then get the contracts for the big power plants to come thereafter. So we truly still have this chicken and egg problem, and we're going to talk about this more on this panel. But I also do see that there is real business opportunity for companies already happening right now and over the next couple of years, and not only in 10 years from now.
It's really interesting. Joanne, it's hard not to turn to you as somebody who's in the supply chain, having heard those comments.
Yeah.
Do you see it the same?
I do, and I think one of the things that we do need to be a little bit careful of the supply chain. Like when we're talking about the things that are happening now, these demonstrator projects, these are more of a one-off for each different technology. And engaging the supply chain in the right way, because there are some companies out there that can do things that can supply services and parts for these plants that are more geared to that sort of custom one-off. But we also need to bring the folks on the journey with us who are going to be like major suppliers of these, what did we, 200 a year that we have to build? Was that what the comment was this morning? So we really need to make sure we're considering the whole supply chain as well as just those who are able to get on board with us right at the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, I fully agree.
So it's a really, really interesting point you make there, I think. Sean, you've managed big supply chains.
Yeah, I think for me is what Joanne's just said is a really important point, is that we don't just want the people who are bespoke, custom made. We need the organisations that will mass produce because of the amount we've got to do. So one of the key things for me is we've got to almost sort of demystify fusion and make sure that actually the supply chain understands how they can fit into this. we talk about it as if it's one big process. It's lots of component parts, lots of elements to that. And if we can break that down so a supply chain can understand that and can get on board early, as we say, they will understand that this is a big market. The challenge we've got is actually bringing that market closer to them, because at the moment it can feel like a long way away. And an ex-colleague of mine many years used to say about innovation is it's all right being at the cutting edge, you don't want to be at the bleeding edge. So we've got to try and bring them together, bring that supply chain together across the piece to understand it's not that far away. Because I think, let's be honest, most people in this room have heard the quote, fusion's always 20 to 30 years away. I don't think it is anymore. What I heard today in all the different sessions about the investors, about the technologies, the roll-off technical solutions that we've got, it feels close to that. There's still a lot to be done, but it feels close to that. And we've got to, I think one of the comments today is we've got to start going out and spreading the word.
It's interesting you mentioned investment. In a moment, I'm going to come to Faris on that. But before I do, Laban, lessons learned from ITER, any reflections on that? Anything different to what Sean says, or would you echo those sentiments?
I'd echo it. I would add two things. We seem to have gained 40 years in the last 10. I'll explain. When I started at ITER about 8 years ago, journalists would tell me the same phrase, fusion is always 50 years away. And then we started making a lot of progress, and journalists would then ask about 2-3 years ago, they would ask, is it true that fusion is always 30 years away? And I thought, okay, we gained 20 years there. And just about last fall, I had a journalist who called me up from Bloomberg and said, so do you subscribe to this idea that fusion is always 10 years away? And so, we're closing the gap. The second thing, Sean said something really important about the disciplines involved. And in the supply chain, fusion needs cutting edge cryogenics, electromagnetics, robotics, and probably half a dozen other fields. In every one of those innovation areas, what we've seen from ITER is that we're creating innovation that also spins out. So there's a double opportunity for the supply chain to be part of a burgeoning fusion industry that's on its way, that's coming, but also what you do in this area can then influence medicine, can influence all sorts of industry and infrastructure and so forth.
Thank you. And in a moment, we'll come on to some of the challenges that are going to be associated with standing up and mobilizing this supply chain. But Faris, that sounds like a lot of capital requirement. Getting that supply chain stood up and ready, tooled up, kitted up, skilled up, that needs investment on a serious scale. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think when you start looking at the fusion energy ecosystem there's more granularity and nuance, but you can boil it down to 3 players. You have your supply chain partners, your reactor developers and integrators, and then your investors. Your supply chain partners are too risk averse to start downpaying, large industrial supply chains to scale up for fusion right now. Your reactor integrators are too capital constrained to be doing, anything past, the internal supply chain to get to their pilot plants. So, they're not able to get past to, factory manufacturing. So that sort of leads the investor is the only one who's capable of risking that capital and putting down that capital to actually downpay these supply chains. But also the investors are interesting here because it's not just a process of elimination. They're the only people who can do it, but they're the people who should be downplaying the supply chain or downpaying the supply chains. Because if you think of a portfolio fusion approach, you start bringing in reactor integrator, supply chain partners, investors start becoming one of the largest aggregators of fusion data, fusion insight, and fusion knowledge, and you're able to serve as a bit of a marketplace between your portfolio and your supply chain partners. So it's not that they're only the only people who should, but they're the best people to do so as well when you start looking at feeding capital and downpaying those supply chains.
Joanne, you're a supplier, you're looking at this market. Chicken and egg, how fast can you go?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, and to tie into what Faris was talking about and where you need those investors. We've got a wide spectrum of supply chain that we're talking about here, like right from someone who needs to develop something brand new that's very specific to fusion, all the way through to someone who's a manufacturer of a product that is going to need just a slight tweak, right, to go into fusion. And on that end of the scale, it's not as much of a challenge, right? Because when they're ready, if hopefully it's not too difficult for them to make that tweak, but they'll see the market and it'll be there for them and they can do that. But when we're talking about technology developers or people who have to upscale significantly from what they do now, that's when we start to talk about the investment and to get those companies through that valley of death that we talk about, right? So at the beginning, when you have this great idea and you have a small company, it's I'm going to say relatively easy, recognizing that it is actually extremely difficult to get investment, for that thing at the beginning. But when you're talking about going from, a few $1 million to start and prove that the thing works, now we're talking about that transition into hundreds of millions of pounds or dollars or pick your currency. That is the hard part, right, for our supply chain to get through and develop. And that's where we do need that investment. So that is a major challenge for a lot of the supply chain.
I'm going to come to sort of Laban and then probably back to Heike and Sean. There's an obligation on the customer to stimulate the supply chain, for sure. Equally, those customers can't give financial commitments beyond where their project's at. You can't go FID before FID. How do you stimulate a supply chain while staying within the gateway confines of your own projects and programs?
Well, I'd say actually we've already done it. I mean, we've spent billions over the last 10, 15 years, ranging from design to manufacturing to global logistics, many areas. So there is in existence, maybe awkwardly, but there is a global supply chain that has supplied JT60SA that opened in Japan recently, the supplied JET longer ago, that has been supplying ITER now. They have had fusion drives precision of components in a way that goes beyond any other industry to this point. So companies like Mitsubishi and Toshiba, and if you look in Air Liquide in France or Rosatom in Russia, many Chinese companies, American, European companies, they've all been pushing the boundaries already. The question for them is, can that expertise translate into new markets? And so part of our task is to connect the two and to encourage more suppliers to enter the race.
Thank you. That's a fascinating point. I think in a moment, Sean, I'm going to ask you about where our supply chain comes from, because I think that's really interesting. What is our supply chain? But Heike, how do you perceive the risks of this, the risks to supply chain surviving long enough to deliver?
I mean, if I look at the laser supply chain, we've been talking a lot about magnetic supply chain now in the previous statement. But if I look at the laser supply chain, and if we imagine building tens and hundreds of laser-based fusion power plants in 10 years from now, suppliers would need to invest now into their capacities and capabilities, right? And that is this chicken and egg problem where, like, obviously they say, like, oh, we don't know if you really will, like, pull in these orders in 10 years from now. But if I look at the individual components, whether that's gratings, for example, for lasers, where we don't even have European suppliers anymore that can produce the size of gratings that we would need. If we look at laser diodes, and if we imagine, like, hundreds of fusion power plants being built, then that would exceed by X factors, like total capacities of laser diodes today, right? So I need to get suppliers to invest into capacities and capabilities now for a market that is coming in 10 years, right? And that is this chicken and egg problem. I think the only ways to get through that is, on the one side, capital, obviously, and then to add to that is, for me, it's early involvement of suppliers to bring them along the journey, show them, say what you do what you say, get trust, as you said, like, into the system, that the fusion industry is really progressing and hitting their milestones. I think that's super important. And the other important factor is a role of government. So government, whether that is through programs like STEP or ITER and so on, so giving out contracts, like acting as a customer. And on the other side, also in Germany, we just saw the announcement of a big public funding program of 370 million, and that is deliberately going into supply chain development as well. So I think that is also how to get, like, these, in our case, like Schott and Zeiss and Trumpf and so on, all of these suppliers being engaged in this market. And I think the third thing is what we just heard on the previous panel, looking at early markets for these technologies to de-risk the profile on the supplier side.
I think the point on sort of early engagement and what good early engagement looks like is certainly something I want to spend a little bit more time on as we go through this. And in a moment, Faris, I'm going to come to you and talk about the sort of commercialization of new technologies, new materials, how we can get new bits of that supply chain geared up. But before we do, Sean, is it the nuclear supply chain? Is it a fusion supply chain? Who's our supply chain?
I think we've talked about actually creating new markets for new suppliers. I think we need to also look at existing suppliers in existing markets and how they can turn their hand to fusion. So an example from my experience on Hinkley is we really needed a lot of very high integrity welding, and it just didn't exist in the marketplace. And we looked for a supply chain to say, how could we do this? And a company not far from where I live, and those from the UK will realise that I live a lot further north than most of you, they had two parts of their business. They had one part of their business that did welding on large-scale vessels. So that's what they would do. They produced that equipment, and that was one part of their business. On the very same site, they were doing hugely high-integrity welding for Formula One. So they were doing these two different things in two totally different parts of their business. And because we got to know our supply chain, and I think that's my message, get to know the supply chain, get to know what's out there, we worked with them and said, look, how can we take those two parts of your organisation and bring them together to give us large-scale, high integrity? So what we did is we worked very hard with them. It wasn't a huge investment, to be honest, Tris. It wasn't a huge investment in terms of capital. They could see a market. They knew it was 5, 10, 15, 20 years in the making. It wasn't their whole business. So it didn't mean that they were risking the rest of their business for this one opportunity. But working with them, explaining our industry, explaining what we needed from them, how they could be successful, they did the core capture for Hinkley. They'll be in the same place for Sizewell. There's a new market for an existing business. So I think sometimes we need to look and think, we don't always have to create a new industry. We can use expertise and skills that was already existing and just twist them and pivot them or blend them or bring supplies together to give us the collective.
Partnerships. Heike, please.
But maybe I can add one thing to that. I think while we obviously in this room all believe fusion is amazing and there is nothing better than to work in the fusion industry, right? When I talk to suppliers, like I talked to a supplier, he was telling me, okay, currently in my R&D department, I have 1,000 open positions that I need to fill. I have a full order book of customers that are paying me money to do something with my engineers tomorrow. And now Heike comes in there and tells me like how fusion is so amazing and it's happening in 10 years and it's going to save the world, blah, 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 for orders to come in the future, right? And that is why I'm saying it's not going to just like be solved by itself. But I think it's like where we need government support to step in, whether that is through like early procurement or whether that is through funding programs or other. It's where we need to build the trust, where we need to communicate, as you said, and so on. Because just because showing to suppliers that there is an amazing market doesn't make them being involved in the market tomorrow.
Agreed. Joanne, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. I think this is a really, really good example of one of the things that's really important. Like when we talk about community engagement, you know, on a bit of a different topic, we talk about knowing the communities you want to go in and understanding what's valuable to them. And I think that concept is really important to supply chain management as well, right? You don't want to go into a company that you know has full order books and not the capacity to even fulfill them and try to get them to pivot when there isn't going to be any return, right? So, you know, what you talked about, you actually went in, engaged with a company, figured out what they do and how that could benefit not only you as somebody needing that supply chain, but how it could benefit them as well. And there's a lot of companies that it's not necessarily just about money, right? And you don't want to make that assumption. And it's so much better to go in there and talk to them about what they value and what they need for their business model and try to integrate that into what you need from your supply chain.
I agree. By the way, I'm coming out for questions in about a minute when Faris has had a say. So if nobody has a hand up and something to say, we'll just start picking on folk at random. So do your neighbours a favour and have a question. Faris, so you're working with spin-outs from MIT. You're at sort of the leading edge of those new parts of the supply chain. What's that part of the journey like?
I think when we're looking at the fusion supply chain, sort of enabling technologies, you know, in our case, materials testing for the fusion industry is what are sort of the opposite of what you're saying, Sean, is we're a new company. What are secondary market opportunities that we can capitalize on existing industries? while we wait for fusion to come along. So I think any of these new companies which are starting to look at the fusion supply chain, it's pretty pivotal for them to be able to apply their technology or slightly adjust their technology or build it platform enough where you can have these pivots along the way to capitalize on lower value market opportunities as you build your way towards fusion. So I think at least for us, when we're thinking about that, that's super important. And that even exists for existing companies today who are trying to capitalize on fusion to hunker down on their secondary opportunities, but also start looking at where can we go from here once the fusion boom does hit.
Awesome. We will, in a moment, start looking at how we address some of the challenges. I want to talk about partnership. I want to talk about the role of government. I want to talk about what good early engagement looks like as opposed to bad early engagement. So you can ponder those while I take the flurry of hands whipping up across the room. Oh, somebody stood up at a really unfortunate moment there. Nothing. No one. Yes. Good man.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot of different fusion approaches today. And do you guys get the sense, I know, Faris, you've done a good bit to study this. Is there enough commonality that for someone who wants to get into the supply chain, it can feel like a portfolio bet? Or does it feel like it's a bet on a specific company if you're going to invest in the supply chain? Because in that sense, like if you're spreading the risk around, I think it can make some sense. But if it's a bet on a specific company, it's kind of like you have to take the same bet that an investor in the fusion company would take with maybe not as much upside. So curious how you guys think about that.
Yeah, if I could say something about that. I mean, I think there are definitely certain supply chain components which are more bespoke to some companies and some which are more uniform. So when I think of making say a capacitor investment, I'm thinking I'm not taking a bet on a specific company, I'm taking an industry bet on a pulse power fusion technology. Or when I'm looking at laser diode investment, I'm betting on the success of a multitude of ICF companies that one would benefit off of a laser diode supply chain. I think once you start looking at company-specific stuff, yeah, you start in pseudo betting on a company again, but there are definitely technologies, HTS manufacturing, which again you bet on the MCF industry and MCF success. So you can sort of broaden out the risk to not be a tech-specific risk, but to be an industry success and a customer offtake risk, that there'll be enough people to take that off.
Heike, you look like you passionately agree with that.
No, I fully agree. So I think there is, as was just stated, like if you want to invest into laser diodes, then that's definitely something where when like whatever laser fusion company will be successful will need laser diodes, but then there's obviously also components that are specific for one laser approach versus the other. So it really depends on like where you sit in the supply chain.
Joanne?
And I think sort of in the bigger picture, the larger fusion industry, there's a real opportunity right now for companies that are a bit more generalist to invest in partnerships and invest in relationships with fusion companies. Because again, a fusion power plant is going to look like a power plant. It's going to have some very, very bespoke, interesting systems when we start to talk about the fusion machine, burrito blankets, giant laser systems, whatever that may be. But a lot of those surrounding things are these more civil, mechanical, electrical things that we're used to. We're used to building buildings, right? And I think that companies that are passionate about fusion but don't necessarily see a real specific technology niche that only fusion needs can still invest in just talking to fusion companies at this point, helping them out with their demonstration facilities, and therefore sort of understanding those specific needs and being better positioned to build these power plants when we're starting to build tens and hundreds of them at a time.
And actually, maybe I can add one point to that, a very specific example. So we've been working with Siemens Energy on power plant development over the past 3 years already. And while at the start of that partnership, there was like 1 or 2 people from Siemens Energy who were enthusiastic about fusion energy and who we engaged with over those past 3 years, I would say there's a whole bunch of people from their end that came and visited us. We had workshops with them. So they are now also like growing a unit within their organization of people who know now a lot more about fusion and like the different approaches and all of that than before. So I would say there's a benefit also for the supply chain company itself to engage with fusion companies and to learn in both directions of like what's happening in the industry, what are the approaches and so on.
Laban, I mean, you work for possibly the ultimate partnership, I guess. What's your views on partnership in the supply chain, and how do you see it really driving us forward?
Well, I think when ITER was designed, we took a decision that was either brilliant or insane, depending on your perspective, because every country involved would have loved to be the host. And so to get that benefit, we divided this machine into 1 million parts and costed out everything and then divided it up among 7 members for Europe. That included, 28 countries. So that meant that we deliberately created a global supply chain. And that's part of the reason that ITER was slow, but I think it's also a value because all those parts had to be shipped from around the world and fit together in a giant sort of Lego. And that means that that's why I say there is that partnership. I think it's a strength. I think that, if Heike does brilliantly and Marvell Fusion builds a plant in some years that can be replicated, you'll still, if we're going to really do this for changing the planet, as she said, it's a global market, and we will have to figure out how to build plants not just in Europe or in places where the countries are allies, but also in places that are ideologically different, because climate change doesn't really have boundaries. So I think that partnership will sometimes have to be people that maybe make you uncomfortable, but that can be seen eventually as part of your market base.
I mean, that's a hell of a point there, working with those who you might not want to work with, but possibly need to. Sean, I mean, AtkinsRéalis, a huge entity, has been in all sorts of partnerships. You're new through the door there, relatively. How do you reflect on partnership in the supply chain?
I think it's inevitable. I think because of the scale of the industry, the risk, and then of hopefully potentially the reward. If you look at, again, using examples of bringing teams together, 2 recent examples to me is the work I was doing on HS2. We realised that the systems contractors all had to work together. It's no point having overhead cables separate from HV power, separate from this, and we can't get them to connect. The integrator and bringing that team together. So there's an alliance being built there that's incentivizing people to work together to share information about interfaces. So this isn't about people losing their IP. I think when we talk about partnerships, that people suddenly get a bit worried about, am I going to give away my secrets? That's not what I see as effective partnership. Effective partnership is how does the things fit together? How do we work at the interfaces of our technology with somebody else's? How do we make those interfaces seamless? How do we make our bits fit together really quickly and easily? But also, it's not just about that. It's about bringing the best of the world industry. So again, go back to, say, Hinkley. French and UK construction companies coming together to build the civil part of that project, integrating the MEH installation by bringing numerous companies with different skills together, again, to manage the interfaces. Our process is going to be as complex, if not more complex, than efficient in some ways. And just to put things in context about those interfaces, they're not just technological, they're physical. They're actually when you build these plants on site. So if you look at one of the nuclear, two units at Hinkley, 4,000 rooms in each reactor. Just think about the HV, the M&E, the control systems, the pipe work, everything that has to be done in those climates. And you have to get the supply chain to work together to do that. Nobody else can manage that. You need them to work together. So partnerships are not just about technology, they're about construction, and ultimately, I guess, they'll be about commissioning and operation as well. So I think it's absolutely essential. I don't think anyone has got all the answers.
There's a threat in this, isn't there? The more we build skills and capabilities, and I'm going to probably come to Faris and Joanne on this, the more we build skills and capabilities in our supply chain for our needs, and we put in very advanced best practice ways of stimulating supply chain growth, we build a pool of resource that other sectors are going to look at and want to engage. Faris, Joanne, how do you see this? Do you see a threat to the fusion supply chain that other industries, potentially ones that can give greater contract certainty, or potentially ones that have a more steady rhythm of orders, might happily harvest the capability we've built in our suppliers?
Sure. Yes, absolutely there's a threat, and we can't be afraid of it. We have to, sort of embrace the fact that there's a lot of sort of big technology things going on in the world right now, and there's going to be a lot of push and pull across industry. But the nice part is, of all of those skills and that supply chain needed for the fusion industry, only a very small portion of it is extremely specific. And I think that cross-pollination of people going to different industries and getting experience in different industries for individuals, and then companies working in and supplying to different industries, actually brings a massive amount of innovation and, well, security, really, for those companies, but for the fusion industry as well. So if things, you know, get delayed a little bit, your supply chain's not going to disappear because they've got other places to go. So I think, yes, it's absolutely a threat, and it's absolutely something we need to think about, but it's not something we're going to be able to sort of design out of the system, and I don't think we want to design it out of the system.
Yeah, I sort of also want to flip that on its head, because I think there's also benefit in having these supply chains being cross-sectional, particularly the talent supply chain. And that, I mean, you look at, there aren't enough fusion engineers in the world to be able to staff fusion companies, so actually having talent, you know, from SpaceX, from some of these other advanced manufacturing companies, and being able to bring them over, send fusion engineers back, educate, and then you get more talent and sort of cross-pollination, like you said. I think that is also equally important. So there's benefit in having these supply chains being linked and similar, because then you can have people moving back and forth in and out of industry.
In a moment, I'm going to... Sorry.
Just add something on that. I think we've got to remember that, you know, everything we've heard today, what we're trying to achieve in this room and other rooms all over the place is something that's going to change society. So you talk about risk of people moving. People will want to be in this space. They'll want to be, you know, I look at, and when I was talking to a colleague over lunch, and when we're looking at attracting, you know, we're in the marketplace for talent across not just our industries, but every industry. Some of our things within the engineering world can maybe not be seen as quite as sustainable, shall we say, as others. This changes, you know, this is energy security. This is putting energy in places where people don't have it at the moment. It's opening up all parts of the world. I think people will want to be in this space, Trish. So I think if we communicate it correctly, people will want to be here and not somewhere else.
Mm. Feel a bit revved up by that. I agree entirely. Colleagues on the panel, any reflections, agreements, or just complete agreement, stunned silence? But I haven't forgotten, by the way, that I said there'd be questions. Is there any questions before we start looking at the role of government and the way that government and client signals? I'm not seeing much coming up. There's nothing appearing on my... Oh, we've got one at the back there. By the way, I'm not checking my text or the football scores here. I'm checking for questions coming in from online. Sorry? Oh, Laban, sorry. Did I exclude you there?
No, not at all. Just a quick follow-up. I think, you know, one of the things that has been true, not 100%, but largely, is that fusion research in the heaviest ways is still a bit of a global north phenomenon. There's some going on in Latin America, not too much, a little bit in Africa, and so there's also that aspect. Everybody's going to start from a different place, and what Sean said about everybody wanting to get involved, there's the market driving that, the size of the market, but there's also the inspiration of leaving a better legacy for our kids, and that's where the inspirational part comes in. This morning I got an email from a representative from the League of Arab States. Two emails. One was from Bahrain saying, is there any way that we could be associated with the ITER project? We got another one from the League of Arab States saying, we just voted to create an Arab fusion energy group. And that kind of communication is surprisingly common that we receive. And they're going to be starting, they don't have a power plant, they don't have a pilot, they don't have a startup, but they certainly have got investment possibility, and they've got a lot of people. So they'll be starting with education and workforce, inspiring kids once they understand what that future could look like if they get into it. So there is also that supply chain of the workforce. Sean has really described that, but I would say it's also global, and the more we go forward, the more we can move that also to include the global south.
Thank you, Laban. That's an incredibly helpful point. Question in the room.
Hello. It's been really encouraging and heartwarming to see so much consensus and agreement on what we all need to do together to make a positive impact on the world. But my question to the panel is, what do you disagree on?
Heike, please.
Maybe not what do I disagree on, but I think I do want to make it clear that this is a clear call for action, and that it will not, like this whole supply chain topic will not just be solved by us being there and doing things. And I think while the workforce topic, yes, people are excited to get into the space, and we also get amazing applications from all around the world and so on. So I'm not too worried about that yet. But we now need suppliers to really invest into their capacities and capabilities. And sitting here as a fusion startup, like, we cannot finance the whole supply chain, and that's what they are asking me today. Basically, those suppliers that tell me, oh, we have 1,000 open positions, they tell me, if you give me an order now to do my R&D work X, Y, Z, then I'm going to do it. But as a startup, we cannot finance the whole supply chain and all the innovation along the supply chain, right? And so I do want to bring across that this is nothing that will be solved by itself, but we need to find those mechanisms of early involvement, government involvement, and so on to get this going.
We've got a few minutes left, and I'm going to finish on good early engagement, but let's take this point a little bit further for a minute. A lot of the companies at the top of the supply chain are startups in this sector because of the nature of the sector. What's the role for government or other third-party actors to give those market signals and give sufficient market confidence to enable the investment needed to get up a supply chain? Question to anyone.
Yeah, I actually like to add a clarification. I don't think necessarily the top companies in this space are startups. I think you have a whole host of industrial incumbents which are just unable to build out enough of a supply chain to be able to do it. So I mean, I think of a company like Leonardo doing glass diodes. You know, they're incumbent. They have the technology to do this, but it's about building out their supply chain to do that. I think of Thales with their gyrotron business. You know, they're institutionalized. So I think that's one piece. But in terms of government support, I think it's purely about providing them risk-free or equity-free capital and grants such that they can start downpaying these supply chains themselves without taking the internal risk on what happens to their capital without fusion panning out.
And I agree with that. And I think the role of government is a lot like the last panel was talking about, was they need to fill the gaps where private investment just doesn't make sense, right? And it's not going to happen. And you know what Heike's talking about with your suppliers saying, listen, I can't fund all of this research when I don't know for sure that it's going to give me orders at the end of the day. So I think those are the spaces where the government has to say, listen, there's a larger social value in the success of this entire industry, and we need to make sure that we're filling those gaps to reach that ultimate social value.
And by the way, I mean, there's also tons of papers and so on that are describing those gaps, right? There was like this basic research needs program in the US. There's like this memorandum that was done in Germany and so on. So there's a pretty good list of like technologies that need to be developed. So it's pretty clear where we would need to invest and what are the topics that need to be addressed.
There we go, a little bit of disagreement for you on the edge. Early engagement. We know on the one hand it could be essential. We know on the other hand that if you engage too early, you can overstimulate a supply chain and lead to nugatory spend. What does good early engagement look like to any of the panel colleagues?
For me, early engagement, we have to know the time scale in the end game, because open-ended early engagement is just chat. It doesn't mean anything. There's no progress. There's no end to that. So early engagement, otherwise you just don't know whether it's early or late, quite frankly. So I think, again, going back to that point about breaking down into a place where the market understands, as Heike said there, we know where those things need to be. But what we need to do is we need to talk to the supply chain and understand what level of investment they need. We don't know that. You know, we think we might need to give X to a certain organisation and Y to another. How do we stimulate it with that balance of government support and incentives? Because it doesn't always have to be cash. It can be incentives. It can be, there are other financial models that governments can give people, tax relief and all sorts of other things that can be done. But it has to be with an end game. The example I gave previously, the supplier knew that if they were successful, they were getting a significant contract with Hinckley and potentially Sizewell and potentially something after that. They saw that, they could see where that was leading. So I think the key thing for us for early engagement is to have a clear end game. It might not be full commerciality. it might be a point in there, and that was like the milestones thing that was said in the previous session. Where are we getting to next?
Yeah.
Brilliant. And I'm being flashed at in red
I
letters
know.
to knock it on the head, and I've got a question online, but
Okay.
go quick.
Sorry, I have 2 very strong opinions on early engagement.
Do it.
First, exactly what you said. You think you know your customer or your supply chain, but talk to them and make sure you understand what's important to them. Second one, say what you'll do and do what you say. For the love of God, don't oversell what you're offering to the supply chain, because you will lose trust so quickly and you will lose them.
Right, and I've
Okay.
got a question come online, and we can use this as a chance to conclude. The question is, what are the useful and positive lessons for fusion we can learn from the fission sector over the last 70 years? I'm going to expand that a bit and say, what's the sort of one, if you had to pick one to go to each of you, lesson you would take from any other sector for growing the supply chain now? So I'm going to come to Laban to kick us off. One lesson, Laban, what should we learn?
There's a weird one. The China, whom we often think of as a big bad guy, is right now outpacing any other country in terms of nuclear fission build. I think they've got 27 reactors under construction, about another 50 to 75 on order. They did that by partnering with France based on testing a lot of different things. Embedded in the development of a Hualong nuclear plant are about 140 small and medium-sized French companies. Just happens to be that partnership. Most people don't know about it, but because they've developed that over decades, they can reliably deliver both to the suppliers that are in their chain and also to their customers on budget, on time, which is a tough thing. I think that's an example of a good lesson from nuclear.
I'm going to come along the line, less than 10 seconds each, and then we'll get off before they start flashing at me again. Sean, one lesson.
One lesson: clarity, timescale, reward.
Heike?
I used to work in the automotive industry before, and I think in the automotive industry you have a nice split between the OEMs building the cars, but also the suppliers being responsible for innovation. And it's super clear that, like Bosch, what kind of like innovation they are having. So really looking at also in the fusion supply chain, what are the innovations that need to happen on a supplier level?
Joanne?
The lesson is from the fission industry. Apply the right amount of quality assurance and safety rigor to the commensurate risk of the item you're designing.
Faris?
Yeah, and similar to the fission industry, formalized industry-wide agreed-upon codes and standards such that suppliers, reactor integrators, et cetera, can all be converging around the same types of technology.
And I'm afraid to say that we've got questions coming in that we are out of time to answer. Valerie, do you want us to stay on the stage or leave the stage for you?
Stay on stage, please. I just want to thank Tris for, fantastic discussion that we had there. All of you were brilliant. Before we go wild and thank our panellists again, I just want to let you know that we're going to start the next session at 5:10. There's no coffee break, but there's just enough time for you to stretch your legs. And our colleagues who are downstairs are going to make their way upstairs for our final talk, which is given by Mark Maslin. He'll be rejoining us to reflect on how we as individuals can move that dial in a meaningful way and play our part in a fusion future that's going to benefit not just ourselves, but our family and the planet as well. So now is the time to go wild, and please thank our panel. Put your hands together for Tris Denton, Faris Fakhry, Joanne Bailey, Heike Freund, Sean Bailey, and of course, Laban Coblentz. Thank you so much.